The bounty rider's arrow splintered against the anvil an inch from Ada Firestone's hand, and she did not so much as blink. "Next one goes through your throat if you loose it in my forge again," she said, still holding the glowing steel to the light, judging the color of the metal with the patience of a woman who had not, in fact, been threatened at all. There were 3 of them at the mouth of her smithy, blocking the afternoon sun with their horses, crossbows and short swords bristling like a bad idea made flesh. The lead rider, a barrel-chested man with a copper bounty seal stitched crooked over his heart, sneered down at her. "Ada Firestone, wanted for the murder of Alderman Corvin Hale by order of the Shipwrights' Council of Dockhaven. Come quiet and maybe you keep that pretty face." Ada set down her tongs. Even streaked with soot, even in the leather smith's apron cinched tight over a fitted crimson underdress that hugged the powerful lines of her body. She was a woman men noticed and then regretted noticing, because noticing her too long meant forgetting to be afraid. And forgetting to be afraid around Ada Firestone was how men ended up eating dirt. She was tall even for an orc, all corded muscle and copper-dark skin, tusks filed neat and short at the tips the way smiths kept them so they would not catch on leather gloves. Her black hair was bound back in a smith's braid, singed at the ends from forge sparks, and her eyes were a deep, banked amber, like coals that had not yet decided whether to flare. "I did not kill Corvin Hale," she said, "and you 3 did not ride 2 days from Dockhaven because you believe I did. You rode because the bounty is fat and the truth is thin. Truth's whatever the council writes on the notice, greenskin." That was when the second arrow came, and this one was not aimed to miss. It never reached her. A man came off the low stone wall at the edge of her yard, vaulting it one-handed, and the arrow buried itself in the haft of a hoe he swung up in its path with the unthinking speed of someone who had done this exact motion, with a blade instead of a garden tool, more times than he wanted to remember. The wood split. The arrowhead stopped a hand's width from his shoulder. "That's enough," Adam Garrison said, and his voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse for the men on the horses than if he had shouted. He was not a large man. Beside Ada Firestone, he looked almost slight, sun-browned from years in the orchard rows, forearms corded with a different kind of strength than hers, the strength of a man who pruned trees and hauled ladders and carried bushel baskets on his back up hillsides. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled, canvas trousers gone soft with wear, boots caked in orchard mud. Nothing about him said soldier. But something about the way he had crossed that yard, the way he planted himself between Ada and the riders without a flicker of hesitation, said otherwise. The bounty rider's sneer faltered. "This isn't your fight, farmer." "She's my wife," Adam said, "which makes it exactly my fight." Ada's amber eyes flicked to him, and for just a moment something unguarded moved behind them, something that had nothing to do with bounty riders or false accusations, and everything to do with the 2 words he had said as easily as breathing. "My wife." As if it were simply true, as if it had always been true. It had only been true for 6 days. The bounty rider spat, wheeled his horse, and the 3 of them retreated at a canter that was not quite a rout but was close enough to feel like one. Ada watched them go until they were dust on the coast road, and only then did she let out the breath she had been holding. "You should not have stepped in front of an arrow, Adam Garrison." "You should not have let one get close enough to need stepping in front of," he said, and pulled the broken hoe from where it had lodged, examining the arrowhead with the flat, assessing calm of a man who had once made his living reading exactly this kind of threat. "That's a Dockhaven Council seal. Someone official wants you dead or dragged back in chains. That's not a rumor anymore, Ada. That's a hunt." She looked down at her hands, forge-scarred, strong enough to fold iron, and for the first time since he had known her, Adam Garrison saw Ada Firestone afraid. It had started 3 weeks earlier, in the busy port town of Dockhaven, where the tide brought in more strangers than the roads did, and the air smelled of pitch and cut cedar and brine, and where an old truce between the coastal humans and the orc clans of the Ashfall Hills was fraying at the edges like old rope. Adam had come to Dockhaven not for trouble but for grafting stock, cuttings for the pear trees he had been coaxing back to life in the orchard he'd bought with his last sellsword's pay, 3 years gone from the road and glad of it. He remembered the sound before he remembered the sight of her. The ring of a hammer on an anvil, clean and true, 3 strikes and a pause, 3 strikes and a pause, coming from the forge district down near the dry docks where the shipwrights kept their fires. He had followed that sound the way a thirsty man follows a stream and found her. Ada Firestone stood at her anvil in the open bay of her forge, sleeves rolled to the shoulder, sweat gleaming on skin the color of banked copper, hammering a curved shipwright's adze with a precision that made the half-dozen human smiths working the same street look like children playing with toys. She wore then what she still wore now, a fitted leather smith's bodice laced up the front over a close-cut linen shirt, dark leather trousers, a heavy work apron slung low on her hips, all of it made to move with her rather than against her, showing the powerful line of her shoulders and the strength in her arms without a scrap of shapelessness to hide it. Every shipwright in Dockhaven wanted a Firestone blade or a Firestone fitting. Her caulking irons never split. Her adzes never chipped. There was a rumor, half joke and half reverence, that Ada Firestone put something of herself into the steel, some stubborn orc will that made the metal refuse to fail its wielder, and looking at her work Adam had almost believed it. He had also, helplessly, immediately, wanted to know everything about the woman making it. He had gone back the next day to order a grafting knife, a small thing, entirely unnecessary for a man who already owned 3, and she had looked up from her anvil with those banked amber eyes and said, "You don't need a 4th knife, human. What do you actually want?" "To hear you work again," he'd admitted, because lying had never come easily to him, and he had decided, standing there with sawdust still on his boots, that he did not want to start lying to this woman. She had laughed. It was not a delicate sound. It came from her chest, rich and startled, as if he had surprised her into it, and she had looked at him a long moment, cataloging him the way a smith studies raw ore, weighing what it might become. "An honest man in a shipyard," she'd said. "That is rarer than good steel." That had been the beginning, though neither of them called it that at the time. He came back. She let him watch her work, and then she started talking while she worked, telling him about the great forge holds of the Ashfall clans where she had trained, about the mourning customs of her people, about the particular arrogance of shipwrights who wanted orc-forged tools but would not share a table with the orc who made them. He told her about the orchard, about the war he had walked away from with all his fingers and most of his conscience intact, about how quiet an orchard was compared to a battlefield, how he had needed that quiet the way a wound needs air. "You do not carry yourself like a man who only prunes trees," she'd said once, watching him lift a length of iron stock as if testing an old habit, and he had not denied it. "I carry myself like a man who's tired of carrying a sword. That's different from not knowing how." She had liked that answer. He'd seen it in the way her mouth curved, the way she'd set down her hammer and looked at him a beat too long before returning to her work. The trouble began the night Alderman Corvin Hale was found dead in the rope walk behind the sail lofts, his skull staved in by something heavy, and a Firestone-marked hammer left conveniently, almost theatrically, beside the body. Ada had not owned that hammer in a month. She had sold it, along with 2 others, to a broker who supplied tools to half the yards in Dockhaven, and any smith with eyes could see the maker's mark had been struck twice, once true and once slightly off-center, the second strike sloppier, as if someone unfamiliar with her tools had tried to counterfeit her signature after the fact and not quite managed the angle. None of that mattered to the Shipwrights' Council, half of whom had never wanted an orc forge thriving in their harbor to begin with, and all of whom needed someone to blame for a dead alderman before the fishing fleet's investors started asking uncomfortable questions about the smuggling contracts Corvin Hale had apparently been running out of his own warehouse. Ada had been arrested within a day. Adam had been at the council hall within the hour, and it was there, in front of a jeering crowd of dock workers and a council bench full of men who would not meet her eyes, that the truce and the trap and the whole tangled mess of her fate had first shown its true shape. The council hall of Dockhaven was a long timber building near the harbor, its walls hung with ship models and old harpoons, and on the day of Ada's hearing it was packed to the doors with shipwrights, rope-walk workers, sailmakers, and dockhands, all of them come to see an orc answer for a human's death. Ada stood at the center of the floor in iron manacles too small for her wrists, chafing raw, her chin high, her amber eyes moving over the crowd without fear, only a weary, banked contempt. Adam stood at the very front, close enough to the low rail that separated the crowd from the accused that he could have reached out and touched her, and it took every ounce of the discipline he'd learned on a dozen battlefields not to vault that rail and put himself between her and the room the way he had once put himself between friends and enemy blades. The truce between Dockhaven and the Ashfall clans was signed not 2 years past, the head councilman intoned, a thin man named Rennick with ink-stained fingers and the permanently pinched look of someone doing sums in his head even while he spoke. That truce was meant to bring peace between our peoples. Instead, we find an orc's hammer at the site of a councilman's murder. Some might say this proves the old wisdom that no truce holds when orc blood runs hot. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd, ugly and eager. That truce, Ada said, and her voice cut through the murmur like her hammer through hot iron, was signed so that men like you could buy tools from smiths like me without pretending you were not desperate for them. I have made you rich, Councilman Rennick. Half the fleet sails on caulking irons I forged with these hands, and you would hang me on the word of a hammer I sold a month ago to a broker 3 streets from here. The maker's mark is struck twice, Ada snapped. Once true and once by a hand that does not know a smith's angle. Bring the broker, bring the buyer's ledger. You will find my hammer changed hands 3 weeks before Corvin Hale died, and you will find it in the possession of a man I have never met. Convenient testimony from the accused. It is not testimony, Adam said, and every head in the hall turned. He had not planned to speak. He had told himself, walking to the hall that morning, that he would watch, that he would learn what he could, that a former sellsword who could still put an arrow through a man's shoulder from 40 paces did not need to draw more attention to himself than necessary in a town, already deciding whether orcs could be trusted. But watching her stand alone in those manacles, watching the crowd bare its teeth at her like dogs sensing a wounded thing, had burned all his careful plans to ash. I bought grafting tools from the same broker not 2 weeks past, he said, stepping up to the rail. Bartle Kess, stall by the rope-walk gate. I saw his ledger myself when he wrote my purchase. If the council will send for it, you will find the sale of 3 Firestone hammers, dated and witnessed, weeks before Alderman Hale died. That is not testimony from the accused. That is a merchant's own record, and any man in this hall can walk 2 streets and confirm it before the sun sets. Councilman Rennick's mouth thinned. And who are you to speak for the accused orchard man? Adam looked at Ada then, and something passed between them, quick and fierce and utterly without doubt on either side, though neither of them had spoken a word of it aloud before this moment. I'm the man who's going to marry her, Adam said, if she'll have me. And I'd rather marry a woman the whole harbor thinks is a murderer and prove them wrong than watch her hang for a crime some coward tried to paint on her, because she's easier to blame than whoever actually split Corvin Hale's skull. The hall erupted. Half the crowd shouted him down as a fool or worse, a traitor to his own kind, a man bewitched by orc trickery. The other half, smaller but not silent, began to murmur about the ledger, about the double-struck mark, about how convenient it truly was that the one piece of evidence against Ada Firestone had appeared so neatly beside a dead man who, everyone in the harbor knew, had enemies of his own among the smuggling contracts he'd been quietly running. Councilman Rennick, sensing the room's temper shifting even a fraction, and no doubt calculating how it would look if he hanged an orc smith on evidence that unraveled the moment anyone checked a public ledger, called for a recess of 3 days to gather further testimony. It was not a victory. It was a stay of execution, fragile as spun glass. But it was enough time for Ada Firestone, standing in her chains with her eyes locked on Adam Garrison's face, to make a decision that would have seemed impossible to her a month before. "You should not have said that," she told him later. In the cell, they let her wait in while the council deliberated. The words half fury and half something rower, something that trembled beneath the anger like a bowstring drawn too tight. "Maybe not," Adam agreed, crouched on the other side of the bars, close enough to feel the heat still radiating off her skin, forge heat, the kind that never quite left a true smith. "But it's true, every word. You do not know me well enough to marry me. I know you well enough to know you didn't kill anyone. I know you well enough to know the sound your hammer makes when you're happy with a piece, and the sound it makes when you're not. And I know which sound I want to keep hearing for the rest of my life. That's more than most people know before they marry." She had gone very still, studying him through the bars with those banked amber eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the distant creak of ships in the harbor and the murmur of the crowd still lingering outside the hall. "My people do not marry lightly," she said finally. "There is a rite, a claiming. It is not undone once spoken. I'm not looking for something that can be undone." Something in her chest seemed to crack open then, some wall she had built brick by brick against exactly this kind of tenderness, and when she spoke again her voice was rougher than he had ever heard it. "If I claim you, Adam Garrison, in front of witnesses, by the old rite, it will not save me from the council's rope if they decide against me at the hearing's end. A human wife does nothing for an orc smith accused of murder in a human court. You would be marrying a woman who may hang in 3 days. Then we have 3 days to prove they're wrong," Adam said. "And I'd rather spend them as your husband than as some man who loved you and never had the courage to say it before it was too late." That was the moment, though Adam would not fully understand it until much later, that Ada Firestone made her choice, the choice that would define everything after. Not a truce between peoples, not a strategic marriage to smooth some council's ruffled feathers, but a claiming born entirely out of the fierce, unlooked-for love of a woman who had spent her whole life being feared, respected, or used, and had found in one quiet orchard man with steady hands someone who simply wanted her. The rite happened that same evening, in the yard behind her forge, by torchlight, with only a handful of witnesses. The broker Bartle Kess, dragged along half against his will to serve as a human witness to the legality of it. 2 of Ada's fellow smiths from the forge district who had no love for the council but plenty for her. And old Soren, a gray-haired orc healer who had settled in Dockhaven's small orc quarter and knew the words of the rite better than anyone else in 3 days' ride. Ada stood before Adam in her smith's leathers, her wrists still bruised from the manacles, and there was nothing soft about the ceremony, nothing that resembled the quiet human weddings Adam had glimpsed in village chapels. Soren cut a shallow line across Ada's palm with a small ceremonial blade, and then across Adam's, and pressed the two together, orc blood and human blood mingling in the torchlight, while she spoke words in the old tongue of the Ashfall clans that Adam did not understand but felt anyway, felt in the marrow of his bones, a weight and a warmth both. "Among my people," Ada told him afterward low, her forehead nearly touching his, her breath warm against his mouth, "we do not offer false comfort to the grieving or the desperate. It is forbidden. If a thing is broken, we do not pretend it is whole, but we may stand beside the broken thing steady until it mends on its own time. That is what I am offering you, Adam Garrison, not comfort, not lies. Only this: I will stand beside you, whatever comes." "That's more than comfort," Adam said. "That's everything." And then he kissed her, there in the torchlit yard with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron still clinging to her skin. And it was not a gentle kiss, not the careful first kiss of 2 people testing uncertain ground. It was hungry and fierce and long overdue. her hand fisting in the front of his shirt to pull him closer, his arms coming around her waist to find her solid and real and finally his. And when they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Bartle Kess, the broker, was blushing furiously, and old Soren was smiling the particular smile of someone who had seen a great many rites and knew, without needing to be told, that this one had taken root somewhere deeper than ritual. They had 6 days of marriage before the bounty riders came to the forge, 6 days that Adam would treasure for the rest of his life, regardless of how the rest of the story ended, because in 6 days Ada Firestone taught him more about being truly wanted than he had learned in 31 years of being overlooked. She had come to live at his orchard, a half-day's ride up the coast road from Dockhaven, because the council's recess meant she could not be seen working her forge in the harbor without risking further arrest, and because, though she did not say this part aloud until much later, she wanted to see the quiet place he had described to her, the rows of pear and apple trees he had coaxed back from neglect, the small stone farmhouse with its crooked chimney, the world he had built for himself after he'd set down his sword. She had stood in the orchard the first morning, sunlight slanting gold through new leaves, and said, "This is a good place, Adam Garrison. A man could forget the world here." "I did for a while," he admitted. "Then I didn't want to forget it anymore. I wanted someone to share it with. And now I have her." She had laughed then, that rich, unguarded sound he'd fallen for in her forge, and swept him off his feet, quite literally, with the effortless strength of a woman who spent her days folding iron, and carried him 3 full strides before he managed to twist free, both of them laughing too hard to stand properly, and it had felt, for one bright, unbroken hour, as if the council and the bounty and the whole tangled danger of Dockhaven were a world away. That had not lasted, of course. Nothing that good ever lasted without a fight to keep it. 2 days after the bounty rider's first visit, Adam found the true shape of the trap that had been laid for his wife, and it began with a name he recognized from the council hearing: Bartle Kess, the broker who had sold Ada's hammers and who had also, it turned out, stood witness to their marriage. Adam rode into Dockhaven at dawn, leaving Ada at the orchard against both their better judgment. She had wanted to come, had argued fiercely that hiding was not in her nature, and only relented when Adam pointed out that a known fugitive riding openly into the town hunting her would end the argument for both of them rather quickly, and found the broker's stall in the Ropewalk district shuttered, a fresh padlock on the door that had not been there 3 days before. The Ropewalk itself stretched long and shadowed between rows of timber sheds, hemp fibers twisting into cable under the hands of workers who barely glanced up as Adam passed, and it was there, crouched near a stack of tarred coils waiting for a merchant ship's rigging, that Adam found a boy no older than 14 who worked odd jobs around the docks and who, for the price of a silver coin and the promise that no one would know who told him, admitted that he'd seen Bartle Kess 2 nights before Corvin Hale's death, arguing with a well-dressed man near the sail lofts, a man the boy recognized as Councilman Rennick's own clerk. "They was talking about the smuggling," the boy whispered. "Alderman Hale's contracts. Something about a shipment the alderman wanted a bigger cut of, and the clerk saying Rennick wasn't about to let that happen, not with the investors watching close as they was. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and Adam Garrison had spent enough years learning to follow threads through worse tangles than this one to know exactly how to pull it. He found Bartle Kess 2 hours later, not at his shuttered stall but hiding in a rented room above a dockside tavern, sweating through his shirt, and it did not take much: a locked door, a steady, unthreatening voice, and the plain truth that an innocent orc woman was going to hang for a crime Kess knew she hadn't committed before the broker broke entirely. "Rennick's clerk came to me the week before Hale died," Kess said, wringing his hands. "Said the council wanted to know which of my customers had bought Firestone tools recent, on account of some dispute over craftsmanship, or so he said. I didn't think nothing of it. Gave him the ledger page. Next thing I know, Hale's dead, and there's a Firestone hammer sitting right there beside the body with my own ledger sale as the proof it was hers. Except it wasn't hers by then. It had already been sold and resold. I know that. I told the council that at the first hearing, showed them my own book plain as day, and they thanked me kindly and told me to keep my mouth shut about the rest of it or find my stall burned down some night when the watch was looking elsewhere. The rest of it being. Kess swallowed hard. Being that Rennick's clerk bought that very hammer off the second owner 3 days before Hale died, paid triple what it was worth and never asked why. I didn't think on it then. I think on it plenty now. Adam felt something cold and clear settle over him, the same feeling he used to get on a battlefield when the chaos suddenly resolved into a shape he could act on. You'll testify to that, in front of the whole council, in front of the whole harbor if it comes to it. They'll ruin me. They'll ruin an innocent woman if you don't. And I promise you, Bartle Kess, whatever Rennick threatens you with, it will be a great deal less than what I do to you if you let my wife hang for a murder his own clerk arranged. It was not the kind of threat Adam Garrison liked to make. He had left that man behind in the orchard rows, or thought he had. But some things were worth becoming for a little while, the man he used to be, and saving Ada Firestone's life was chief among them. He rode back to the orchard that evening with the broker's shaky promise of testimony tucked away like a blade up his sleeve, only to find the farmhouse door standing open and the lamps unlit, and his heart went from a steady beat to a hammering roar in the space of one terrible breath. Ada! No answer came from the house. He went through it room by room, and found nothing overturned, no sign of struggle, which frightened him more than wreckage would have, because it meant whoever had come for her had either taken her by surprise entirely or had not needed to fight at all. It was the note pinned to the orchard's front gate, weighted down with a river stone, that told him the truth, and it was written in a careful clerkish hand that made his blood run cold with recognition. The Orc Smith comes to the harbor at moonrise, alone and unbound, or the bounty riders take what they came for and burn the orchard besides. Councilman Rennick sends his regards to the sellsword, who thinks he can unmake a truce. She had gone to protect him. She had gone alone, into a trap she must have known was a trap, because the alternative was letting the men who wanted her dead put a torch to the only home either of them had. And Ada Firestone, Adam understood in that gutting, terrified moment, would rather walk willingly into a noose than let harm come to the man she had claimed. He did not waste time on fear. He saddled the horse he kept for orchard errands, took down the old sellsword's blade he had hung above the hearth 3 years before and never once drawn since, and rode for Dockhaven at a pace that would have killed a lesser animal, the moon already climbing pale and cold over the black water of the harbor by the time he reached the Ropewalk district. He found her exactly where the note had promised, on the open dry dock where half-built hulls stood like the ribs of great beached whales in the moonlight, timber scaffolding rising around them, the smell of pitch and cut cedar thick in the night air. Ada stood at the center of the dock with her wrists bound in rough rope this time, no council manacles required because there had been no arrest, only 3 bounty riders and Councilman Rennick's own clerk standing over her with a drawn crossbow, and behind them at the dock's edge, Councilman Rennick himself, his ink-stained fingers laced together in front of him like a man tallying a debt. "You didn't need to come," Ada said the moment she saw him, her voice raw with fury and fear both. "I told them you would not follow. I told them you had more sense." "You told them wrong," Adam said, dismounting, the old blade heavy and familiar in his hand in a way that felt like putting on a coat he'd sworn never to wear again. "I was never going to let you face this alone." Rennick stepped forward unhurried, the picture of a man who believed the night's outcome was already decided. "Orchard man, you've caused me considerable trouble. My clerk tells me a broker in the Ropewalk has grown loose-lipped." "He has," Adam said. "He'll testify at dawn that your clerk bought the murder weapon days before Hale died, and paid triple to make sure no one asked why. Everyone in that hall will understand exactly what happened." You killed Hale over his cut of your smuggling contracts, and you needed someone to hang for it fast, before the investors started digging into your books instead of hers. The clerk's crossbow hand wavered just slightly and Rennick's mouth thinned in the moonlight. A pretty theory. It will not save her tonight. Bounty riders acting on a lawful council writ, defending themselves against a fugitive who resisted. These things happen in the dark, and no council hearing questions a body too closely. Then you'll have to go through me first, Adam said, and set himself between Ada and the crossbow the same unthinking way he had set himself between her and an arrow 6 days before. Except this time the stakes were not a warning shot but a killing one, and he knew it, and he did not move. What happened next happened fast, the way violence always did, faster than fear had time to properly land. The clerk, panicked by the broker's betrayal and Rennick's failing composure, loosed his crossbow, not at Adam, who stood directly in his line but wide, a badly rattled shot that Adam barely needed to duck. But one of the bounty riders, seeing the shot go wide and the whole plan unraveling, lunged instead for Ada herself, meaning to drag her toward the water's edge and a waiting boat. A last desperate attempt to salvage the bounty even as the trap collapsed around them. Ada, bound wrists and all, drove her shoulder into the man's chest with the force of a woman who had spent her whole life hammering iron into submission, sending him sprawling across the dock boards, and in the same motion twisted her bound hands up and around to catch the edge of a caulking mallet left forgotten on a nearby workbench. One of her own forged tools, Adam realized with a jolt, sold to this very dockyard weeks before, now serving its maker in the moment she needed it most. She swung it once hard, and the bounty rider who'd grabbed for her went down and stayed down. And by then, Adam had closed the last few strides between himself and the clerk, knocking the spent crossbow from his hands and pinning him against a stack of timber with the flat of his blade laid cold against the man's throat. Not enough to cut, more than enough to still him utterly. Rennick, seeing his hired men broken and his clerk disarmed, backed toward the dock's edge, and it was there, with nowhere left to run, and the whole dry dock suddenly ringed with lanterns as dockworkers and night watchmen came running at the commotion, drawn by shouts and the clatter of the fight, that the councilman's careful composure finally shattered entirely. She was always going to hang for something, Rennick spat, wild-eyed, cornered. An orc smith too clever, too favored, taking work that should have gone to honest human hands. I merely chose the crime that suited the moment. The words hung in the lantern light, heard by every dockworker and watchman now crowding the scene, and Adam saw the exact instant understanding rippled through the gathered crowd, the exact instant the truth of what Rennick had just confessed to in front of witnesses on the open dock began to sink in. "You admit it," said one of the night watchmen, stepping forward slowly, his own crossbow lowering rather than raising. "You admit you framed her." Rennick opened his mouth to deny it, to twist the words back into something survivable, but it was too late. Too many people had heard him say it plainly, in his own furious voice, with no room left for doubt. Ada crossed the dock in 3 long strides, still bound at the wrists, rope-walk mallet still in hand, and stood over the fallen bounty rider and the cornered councilman both, and when she spoke her voice carried across the whole dry dock, clear and steady and utterly without mercy. "I did not kill Corvin Hale. This man did, or had it done, and then tried to hang his crime on the nearest orc he could find, because it was easier than admitting a human councilman had grown as corrupt as any smuggler in his harbor. You have all just heard him say so, in his own voice, with no blade at his throat forcing the words from him." The crowd did not cheer, not exactly, but something in the air shifted, a tide turning, dockworkers and watchmen alike lowering weapons, murmuring to one another, and Adam Garrison stood in the lantern light with his old blade still drawn and watched the woman he had married 6 days before stand tall and unbroken and utterly, magnificently vindicated in front of the very town that had condemned her. The formal hearing 3 days later was a formality in truth, A public unraveling rather than a genuine trial, because Rennick's confession on the open dock had already traveled through every tavern and timber yard in Dockhaven by the following dawn, embellished and retold a dozen ways, but always landing on the same essential truth. The council had tried to hang an innocent orc smith to cover a corrupt councilman's crime, and a former sellsword-turned-orchard farmer had ridden alone into the harbor to stop it. The council hall was packed tighter than it had been for Ada's first hearing, and this time the crowd's mood had turned entirely. Dockworkers and shipwrights who had once shouted for her hanging now craning to see the woman whose forged tools half of them still relied on, whose husband had faced down bounty riders and a corrupt councilman both to save her. Bartle Kess testified, sweating but resolute, laying out the ledger and the clerk's suspicious purchase in plain terms any dockworker could follow. The night watchman who had heard Rennick's confession on the dry dock testified next, and then two more who had been close enough to hear it, and by the time the council's remaining members, Rennick himself now sitting in the very chains Ada had once worn, his clerk beside him called for a vote, there was no real question left to vote on. Ada Firestone, the eldest remaining councilman said, his voice heavy with the particular shame of a man who had sat silent through the first hearing and now had to undo it. The council finds the charges against you baseless, and offers what apology such a council can offer for the harm already done. Corvin Hale's death lies at the feet of Councilman Rennick and his clerk, who will answer for it under proper law. The hall erupted, not in the ugly jeering roar of the first hearing, but in something closer to a cheer. Dockworkers stamping their feet, shipwrights calling her name, and Ada Firestone stood in the center of it all, unchained, unbroken, and turned to find Adam already moving toward her through the crowd. And she did not wait for him to reach her fully before she closed the last of the distance herself, catching his face in both scarred hands and kissing him in front of the entire hall. In front of every man and woman who had once been ready to watch her hang. "You came for me," she said against his mouth, when they finally broke apart, breathless, the crowd still cheering around them as if it were a festival rather than a courtroom. "You rode into a trap alone, with a sword you swore you'd never draw again because you thought I needed saving." "You didn't need saving," Adam said. "You'd already broken a man's ribs with a caulking mallet before I got there. I just wanted you to know you didn't have to do it alone." "No one has ever wanted to stand beside me for my own sake," Ada said, quieter now, her forehead against his, the noise of the crowd falling away into something private even in the middle of that packed hall. "Not truly. Men wanted my forge or feared my strength or tolerated me because the truce demanded it. You wanted none of those things. You simply wanted me." "I still do," Adam said. "Every day since I first heard your hammer on that anvil." That evening, back at the orchard, with the trial behind them and the bounty lifted and Councilman Rennick awaiting judgment in a cell that had briefly, wrongly, held Ada instead, she led Adam out among the pear trees in the blue dusk light and pressed something small and heavy into his hands. A hammer, but not one of the great smithing hammers she used at her anvil. This was smaller, finer, its head marked with her own true maker's stamp struck clean and centered, the kind of tool a master smith kept for her own private use and gave to no one, ever, because it represented not just her craft but her name, her rank among the Ashfall Forge holds, the whole of her hard-won independence forged into a single object. "This is my journeyman's hammer," she said, watching his face in the fading light. "I made it myself, the year I earned my master's mark, and I have never let another hand hold it since. Among my people, to give this to someone is to say, you are not separate from my work, from who I am. You are woven into it now. I do not offer this lightly, Adam Garrison, and I have never offered it before." Adam turned the hammer over in his hands, feeling the weight of what she was actually giving him, not the tool itself but the trust behind it, the whole guarded, hard-fought independence of a woman who had built her name with her own two hands and had just handed a piece of that name to him. "I'll keep it safe," he said, throat tight. "Always." "I know you will," she said. That is precisely why I am giving it to you." He set the hammer down carefully on the low stone wall beside them, and then he pulled her into his arms, and this time there was no crowd, no council, no bounty riders, only the two of them beneath the pear trees with the evening settling soft and gold around them. And when he kissed her it was slow this time, unhurried, a claiming of an entirely different kind than the rite that had bound them 6 days before. This one asked for nothing and demanded nothing, simply offered itself. And she took it the way she took everything worth having, fully, fiercely, without reservation. They did not make it back to the farmhouse for some time. Later, tangled together in the wide bed beneath the crooked chimney, her braid unbound and spilling dark across the pillow, her scarred hands tracing the old faded scars on his shoulders with a tenderness that had nothing to do with the strength that could fold iron, Ada spoke into the quiet dark in a voice stripped of all its usual iron edge. "I have watched grief hollow out my kin," she said. "Watched them offered false comfort, pretty lies about how a wound will not scar, and I have watched those lies rot something in them worse than the grief itself. That is why my people forbid it. We do not tell each other the broken thing is whole. We simply stand beside it steady and let it mend at its own pace, or not mend at all, and either way we do not leave." "And you think I'm broken," Adam said, not quite a question. "I think you spent years believing no one would ever choose you first," she said. "Not for your sword arm, not for your usefulness, but simply for the man you are when you are only tending your trees and asking nothing of anyone. I am not offering you comfort, Adam Garrison. I am offering you this: I choose you. Not the trade you may bring, not the shelter, not even the sword you drew for me on that dock, though I will treasure that until I die. I choose the quiet man who grafts pear trees and speaks the truth even when it costs him. I will keep choosing him every day for as long as I have breath to do it." Adam had faced down bounty riders without his voice breaking. It broke now. "No one's ever said that to me," he admitted. "Not once, not in 31 years. "Then I am glad to be the first," Ada said, and drew him closer, and the rest of what passed between them that night needed no more words at all, only the warm, unhurried certainty of two people who had each, in their own hard-won way, stopped being alone. The weeks that followed were not without their own small struggles, because a truce broken by scandal does not mend itself simply because one corrupt man is punished. And there were still shipwrights in Dockhaven who muttered about orc smiths and human farmers marrying against the old grain of prejudice. Still dockhands who crossed the street rather than walk past Ada's reopened forge. But the muttering grew thinner every week, worn down by the simple, stubborn fact of Ada Firestone's continued excellence. No one else in 3 days' sailing could forge a caulking iron that never split, and there is a particular kind of prejudice that erodes fastest against a person's plain, undeniable skill, and by the sight of the two of them together, often enough for the whole harbor to grow used to it. Adam Garrison hauling crates of ore and coal to his wife's forge on market days. Ada Firestone riding up the coast road on quiet evenings to help him prune the orchard's oldest, most stubborn trees with a strength no saw could match. Councilman Rennick and his clerk were tried under proper law within the month, the smuggling contracts and the murder both laid bare before a new council seated in the old one's place, and the last of the bounty notices bearing Ada's name were burned publicly in the harbor square. A small ceremony that the whole forge district and half the rope walk turned out to watch, cheering as the paper curled to ash. It was on the day the notices burned, standing together at the edge of that cheering crowd with the sea wind coming cool off the harbor and gulls wheeling overhead over the masts of a dozen ships under construction, that Adam Garrison turned to his wife and said the thing he had been carrying quietly since the night on the dry dock. "I never got to ask you properly," he said. "Everything happened so fast. The rite, the trial, the dock. I never got to ask you the way I meant to." Ada raised a dark brow, amusement warming her banked amber eyes. "Ask me what husband? We are already bound. The rite does not need repeating." "Not the rite," Adam said. "This." And there in the harbor square, with the ash of false accusation still drifting on the wind and half of Dockhaven still watching, though neither of them cared any more who saw, Adam Garrison went down on one knee before Ada Firestone, the master smith who had once told him she chose comfort for no one and had chosen him anyway, and said the words he had been saving. "I know your people already have their right, and I know it's already bound us tighter than any human vow could. But I want you to hear this too, in my own words, in front of everyone who once thought you didn't belong here. Ada Firestone, I love you. Not the truce, not the trade, not the story the whole harbor's telling about the man who rode in to save the orc bride. Just you, the woman who hammers iron until it sings and laughs like she means it, and chose a lonely orchard farmer when she could have chosen anyone. Will you stand at that threshold with me, not the one behind us, but everyone still ahead for as long as we both keep breathing?" Ada Firestone, who had faced bounty riders without flinching, who had stood chained before a hostile council with her chin unbowed, who had broken a man's ribs with her own forged mallet to protect the life she'd built, found her vision blurring, and did not try to hide it, not from him, not from the whole gathered crowd of the town that had so nearly cost her everything. "Yes," she said, low and rough and utterly certain, pulling him up to his feet so she could kiss him properly, right there in the harbor square, in front of shipwrights and dockhands and gulls and the drifting ash of every false accusation that had ever tried to unmake her. "Yes, Adam Garrison. I sealed my fate the night I claimed you, and I have never once regretted it. I will stand at every threshold you name, for as long as there is breath in me to stand there." The crowd around them, the very same harbor that had once howled for her hanging, cheered loud enough to send the gulls scattering skyward, and somewhere behind them a ship's bell rang out across the dry docks, clear and bright, as if the whole town had decided all at once to mark the moment properly. They walked back to the orchard together that evening, taking the long way along the coast road as the sun sank gold and red into the sea. Ada's journeyman hammer safe in the small leather satchel Adam had made specially to carry it, her hand in his the whole way, and neither of them spoke much, because there was nothing left that needed saying that they had not already said, in a forge yard by torchlight, on a dry dock under a cold moon, in a harbor square before a cheering crowd. When they reached the crooked farmhouse beneath the pear trees, the last light fading purple over the hills, Ada paused at the threshold, one hand braced against the doorframe, and looked back at him with a small, private smile that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "A husband should carry his wife over the threshold, I am told, some human custom. You could probably carry me easier," Adam said, laughing. "Undoubtedly," Ada agreed, and swept him up regardless, exactly as she had that first bright morning in the orchard, carrying him over the threshold of the home they had built together in a handful of desperate, glorious days, both of them laughing too hard to manage it with any dignity at all. And it did not matter, because dignity had never been what either of them wanted from this. What they wanted was exactly what they had: a hearth, a threshold, a hammer given in trust, a vow spoken twice over in two different tongues, and a love that had begun as a rite meant only to bind an orc smith to a truce, and had become, instead, the truest thing either of them had ever known. The pear trees blossomed early that year, white and gold under a sky finally, fully at peace, and in the forge district of Dockhaven, 3 streets from the harbor, the ring of a hammer on an anvil rang out steady and clear each morning. 3 strikes and a pause, 3 strikes and a pause, and anyone passing close enough could hear, beneath the clang of steel, the low warm sound of a woman humming an old ashfall working song, no longer alone at her anvil, no longer hunted, no longer bracing against a world that had once wanted to hang her only home, and staying, and utterly, unshakably loved.